Gonzaga has a rich history of players breaking out as sophomores, and Dusty Stromer is primed to be the team's next great success story.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Tuesday, and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet on FanDuel, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Just visit FanDuel.com today to get started. Well, craziness in the kennel is in the rear view mirror. We got an official word about Gonzaga's secret scrimmage, not so secret anymore, against USC. It's a charity exhibition game on October 26th, and we are continuing our player preview series here today on Locked On Zags. This will be our second iteration. We talked about Ben Gregg last week. We're talking about Dusty Stromer today, the player preview series. For those of you who are new to the Locked On Zags podcast, we've been doing this for the last, 3, maybe 4 years now, going back to when I was hosting the Score Zags Score podcast. This is a series where we discuss every player on Gonzaga's roster. We're talking about their season last year, their history coming into Spokane. We're also talking about their best and worst case scenarios for this upcoming season, what that might look like, closing out the show with their more expected role, expected production for them this upcoming season, and then the future. How many more years are they going to be at Gonzaga? Do they have an NBA future? All that good stuff. Like I said, today we're talking Dusty Stromer. After talking about Ben Gregg last week, Stromer felt like the obvious player to talk about after a very strong performance at Craziness in the Kennel. We'll start with his history. Stromer was a 4-star shooting guard in the 2023 recruiting class. He's from Sherman Oaks, California, played at Notre Dame High School, was the 63rd ranked prospect in the 2023 class at 247 Sports. We'd seen some other places that had him a little bit higher. Like a lot of players that Gonzaga pursues, we see them kind of move up the rankings later in their high school career. I think this is a testament to Gonzaga's very strong scouting and just ability to identify talent and identify players who they believe are not only going to be good fits in their system, but guys who they think if they can get in on them a little bit earlier, identify them as freshmen or sophomores or freshmen in high school, they can kind of maybe make a push for those guys. And we've seen like Davis Fogel, who's in the 2025 class, is a guy who was not even top 100. And then I think by the time Gonzaga recruited him, he was like barely top 75. Now most places have him in the top 50 of that 2025 class. Stromer kind of had a similar trajectory. Many of his teammates at Notre Dame High School went on to play Division I basketball. Very, very talented high school program. He played Bronny James, who was at Sierra Canyon High School, a whole bunch of times. I think they played like 5 times against each other in high school, and I think Stromer beat him every single time. That comes into play when we talk about Stromer's freshman year at Gonzaga as well. Dusty committed to Gonzaga back in May of 2022, about 2 weeks after he formally got an offer from the Zags, so it's clear this is a place that he really wanted to play. He had offers from some other great programs. Arizona made him an offer. So did UCLA. We saw Rutgers, Louisville, San Diego State, Cal, and Illinois among the many programs that had offers out to Dusty Stromer. But again, he committed to Gonzaga back in 2022 and then joined the program ahead of the 23-24 season last year as a true freshman. And Mark Few doesn't start true freshmen very often. It is rare to see guys start right away in that first season. The 5-star, like high-level talent guys have done it. Chet Holmgren did. Jalen Suggs did. But even Zach Collins, who's the other kind of pseudo 5-star, some places had him as a 5-star talent. He didn't start as a freshman. So it's rare to start as a true freshman. The only reason Stromer did is because of the injury to Steele Venters last year, suffered after the college basketball season had began, but before Gonzaga played their first game, which was November 10th against Yale. I think 2 days prior to that, Steele Venters suffered his ACL injury, costing him all of last season. At that point, Gonzaga had to make a switch. The plan was that Steele Venters was going to start, and when he went down with that injury, we saw Venters get pushed into we saw Stromer get pushed into the starting lineup. He ended up starting 15 of Gonzaga's first 16 games last season. The only game he did not start was against Arkansas Pine Bluff. The team started Jun-Suk Yo in that game instead. But as a starter, we saw some good and some bad things from Dusty Stromer. again, we talked about this in the Ben Gregg episode. It was a tale of two seasons. It's a tale of two seasons for Ben Gregg. The first half of the season when he was coming off the bench, the second half of the season when he was a starter. And it's the same in reverse for Dusty Stromer. The first half of the season when he was a starter, the second half of the season when he was coming off the bench. In those first 16 games, again, 15 of them where he was a starter, Stromer averaged about 28 minutes a game, 6 points, 4 boards, 1.5 assists, just under a steal per game, and 1.1 turnovers. But he was not an efficient scorer. Under 40% on two-pointers, about 39.3%, and then 32.1% from the three-point line. That was on about 3.5 attempts per game. So pretty below average three-point shooter, below average two-point scorer. In terms of efficiency, he was excellent from the free throw line, 87%, although he didn't get there all that often, wasn't really a guy who was putting a lot of pressure on the rim and drawing contact in that way. He did have some good performances, 9.6 boards and 2 steals against Purdue in the Maui Invitational. That was a nice performance from him against a very, very good team. First game in double figures came later that month against Bakersfield. He had 10 points in that game. And then arguably his best game of the season, or certainly his best game as a starter, came against USC. I mentioned we'd bring up Bronny James again. Bronny did not play in that game. He was still recovering from that cardiac arrest suffered in July. He made a season debut a few weeks later, but doesn't matter. If Dusty Stromer's playing against Bronny James's team, he is going to do good things. That's what happened in this one. 15 points, 5 boards, 2 assists for Stromer. He had 4. It was 4 of 9 from the three-point line. This was definitively his best game of the first half of the season in Las Vegas. Fantastic performance from him. At the time, we didn't know that USC was going to be capital B bad, so it kind of felt like an even bigger win, an even bigger performance for Stromer. It turns out USC was just not good last year, but still really nice to see Stromer have that kind of performance. Shortly after that, though, he kind of hit a bit of a wall. We had an 8-game stretch from December 9th, which was the game against Washington, to January 11th, which was the game against Santa Clara, the last game Dusty started. In that stretch, Stromer averaged 5 points a game, so his scoring didn't drop much, but he was 26% from 3. He had 2 games in that stretch where he didn't score at all. Those were the aforementioned games against Washington and Santa Clara. Not coincidentally, those were also the first 2 true road games that Gonzaga played that season. This is one of the things I advocate strongly for, more road games whenever possible. And I don't blame Gonzaga for not having a lot of road games, because it takes 2 to tango, and you're not going to play a team on the road unless they're willing to play you at home. And a lot of the times teams aren't willing to play Gonzaga at home, so you don't see true road games. But for Gonzaga, the fact that Braden Huff and Dusty Stromer really struggled in that Washington game, I think, was a testament of it's really hard to play on the road. And they struggled in that Santa Clara game too. And so I think the more road games you can play, especially with a team of newer players or younger players, the better. And I think that was demonstrated by the fact that Stromer struggled in those first couple of road games that he played. After that game on January 11th against Santa Clara, Mark Few made a switch that we've talked about so many times on the podcast, because it was a tremendous season-saving move by the coach to switch Ben Gregg into the starting lineup, which gave Gonzaga a bigger lineup, but worked because of Anton Watson's flexibility and Ben Gregg's flexibility. It also took a lot of pressure off Dusty Stromer coming off the bench. He played a much different role, was asked to do less, and I think it helped him find more confidence and be a better contributor to Gonzaga in terms of what they needed from him. It really worked out for all parties. In the next 14 games for Stromer, he averaged 20 minutes a game, 4 points, 3 boards, just under 1 assist, a little less turnovers as well, under 1 per game there. He's 40% on two-pointers, so that didn't change all that much, but the three-point percentage bumped up to 36.5% on a slightly decreased amount. He went down to 2.4 three-point attempts per game. He was still 80% from the free throw line. He had some great performances in there, 11-5 at San Diego, 10-4 against Santa Clara. Nice revenge there after not playing well against them the first time. When Santa Clara came to Spokane, Stromer was ready for him in that one. And then we saw some good moments from Stromer in the WCC and NCAA tournament as well. His playing time dipped a little bit there, as we've kind of seen from Mark Few. The rotation tightens up when you get to the end of the season and when you get to the games that significantly matter. Stromer only played 7 minutes against San Francisco, played 17 minutes against St. Mary's in the WCC championship, but did not score. Was better after that, 10 points, 2 of 3 from 3 against McNeese in the first round of the NCAA tournament, a game Gonzaga just obliterated the Cowboys in. 3 points in 15 minutes against Kansas. Had a pair of offensive boards against Purdue, but did not score in that final game for Gonzaga last season. And then, of course, The most recent update on Dusty Stromer looked very good at Craziness in the Kennel, won the 3-point shootout against Nolan Hickman, Khalif Battle, and Braden Huff. I scored a game-high 11 points in the scrimmage. We saw some more offensive versatility from him, driving to the basket, looking a little bit more fluid, looking a little bit more comfortable with the ball in his hands. And that's what we want to talk about now. Stromer's entering his sophomore year. We've seen a lot of players explode as sophomores. Could that be the case for Dusty Stromer? What does the second season look like? We're going to talk about that through the best and worst case scenario outcomes, all coming up in just a second. Right after I talk to you about our Roy Player of the Week. This week, we're showing some love to who else but Dusty Stromer. We're putting $100 on Dusty Stromer right now through Roy, the ultimate platform where you get to directly support your favorite athletes. Download Roy on iOS or Google Play Store. No middleman, no collective making the decisions for you. You get to decide who gets the backing, and it's as easy as just a few clicks. Here's the best part. With Roy, you know exactly where your money's going. Roy gives you the power to decide who gets your support. Time to put your money where your mouth is. Every contribution from fans like us helps keep athletes committed to the team. And if they decide to transfer, you get your money back. How is that for transparency? So what are you waiting for? Download the Roy app today and make your contribution. Not only are you supporting the athlete's journey, but you're also helping to keep our team strong for this upcoming season. Remember, if they stay, you win. If they leave, no worries. You get your cash back. That wraps up our Roy Player of the Week segment. Don't forget, if you want to support more athletes and be a part of their success stories, Roy is the way to go. Keep those contributions coming, and we can change the NIL game. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, still moving through our Dusty Stromer season preview episode here. We're doing one of these for every player on the roster here in the second segment. We're talking best case scenarios, worst case scenarios for the upcoming season. I'll give you the caveat that I always do. Best case within reason, worst case without injury. The player's best case scenario is that they could win the National Player of the Year. We're going to say that. If that's not really within the realm of outcomes, of possible outcomes, we're not going to say it. We're going to keep it within the reasonable range of outcomes. Worst case scenario without injury. Duh. Every player's worst case scenario is what has unfortunately happened to Steel Ventures the last 2 years. It's not good analysis to just say, oh, the worst case scenario for Dusty Stromer is he gets hurt and misses the year. If injuries are a part of a player's history, we will discuss them, but otherwise, we're going to leave that out of this conversation. So what is the best case scenario for Dusty Stromer? Well, the best case scenario for Stromer is that he is a day one starter at small forward and he plays 25 to 30 minutes a night. And I want to be clear here that we're talking best worst case scenarios for Dusty Stromer, not necessarily for Gonzaga. Having said that, if Mark Few starts Dusty Stromer and if Mark Few plays Dusty Stromer 30 minutes a night, it is because he believes it is what is best for the team. In that reality, we are looking at what is the best case scenario for Dusty Stromer and hopefully what is the best case scenario for the team. I'm not going to sit here and say that Mark Few has never made a mistake in terms of where he allocates playing time. It happens. It has happened before. It will happen again. But again, something that we're saying is the best case scenario for Dusty, you may say, well, that doesn't seem like it's best for the team. It may not be, but we're talking about it from the perspective of Dusty Stromer. In a situation where Dusty is the starter at the small forward spot, it means that either Ben Gregg or Michael Ajayi is coming off the bench. It also almost certainly means that Khalif Battle is coming off the bench. And again, maybe that happens. Maybe that works. There's a possibility where that's an outcome that exists. But I'm not super sold that he will be a starter necessarily. But it's, again, in the best case scenarios for him, that's what happens. Statistically, the best case scenario for Dusty Stromer is that improvement that we saw from him as a three-point shooter in the second half of last season. Again, he was 41% after he got switched to coming off the bench. For the rest of the season, he shot 41% from three. That improvement sticks for a full season. Dusty Stromer finishes his sophomore year shooting 42% from three or better in a best case scenario. He is an absolute sniper from beyond the arc. He can hit him from the corners. He can hit him from the wing. He can hit him from the top of the key. He is a must-guard player on the perimeter for Gonzaga all season long. The best case scenario for Dusty Stromer is that he showcases more offensive versatility. We saw snippets of this in the scrimmage game, but again, we need to see that translate into game scenarios. Last year, Stromer was fairly one-dimensional offensively. He could do straight line drives to the basket if they were there. He could get out in transition and score. He could hit standstill corner threes. In a best case scenario for Stromer, we see more to his offensive game. That would be improved ball handling skills. He can get wiggly and get to the basket in different ways. He can finish through contact and get to the free throw line, learn from his buddy Khalif Battle, who is outstanding at that. He can develop a floater. Maybe he learned this from Julian Strother and is now ready to kind of bring that out. I guess him and Strother were never teammates, but maybe they work together in some way. We've seen plenty of other Gonzaga players. Anton Watson had a good floater. Let's use him as the example. For Stromer, because he's still slender framed, even if he's stronger than he was last year, which in a best case scenario, he would clearly look stronger than last year. You still want to have that floater to be able to neutralize shot blockers and not be forced to drive directly into contact every single time. Best case scenario for Dusty Stromer is improved floor vision and passing skills. Wasn't a great passer last year. Wasn't asked to be. Didn't really need to be in the roles that he was filling. But in a best case scenario, we see improvement in that area. Last year, his assist to turnover ratio was 39-30. It's not great. This year, that's improved. More assists, less turnovers, or depending on the playing time, a similar amount of turnovers, but just more ability to identify open players, drive and dish, those kind of things that we didn't really see from him much last year. Obviously, the added strength is a best case scenario, not just offensively, but defensively as well. Dusty Stromer is already a good on-ball defender. He's already got the instincts to be a good defensive basketball player at the collegiate level. But in the best case scenario, he's stronger and he's better at getting takeaways. He was a good defender last year, but he didn't generate a lot of steals. He didn't generate a lot of blocks. More physicality, more disruption at the point of attack allows him to create more turnovers and get out in transition more, which allows to more scoring opportunities. He is tasked with defending the opposing team's best player when he is on the floor, and that makes him somebody who plays big, valuable minutes for Gonzaga because of what he brings on the defensive end of the floor. The best case scenario for Dusty Stromer is that he's an all-WCC honoree. In an absolute best case scenario, we said we're keeping it realistic. The best case scenario is all-WCC first team for Dusty. That's probably the high end of outcomes we could see from Dusty as a sophomore in this upcoming season, but it is the best case scenario for Stromer. The best case scenario for Dusty Stromer is that fans are genuinely concerned at the end of the year that he's going to go to the NBA and he is not going to be back and he's only going to spend 2 years in Spokane. Let's talk worst case scenarios for Dusty Stromer this upcoming season. Well, the worst case scenario for Stromer is that the addition of Battle and Ajayi pushes Stromer into a less consistent role. He's coming off the bench. Some nights he's playing 20 minutes, 22 minutes. Some nights he's playing 12. Some nights he's playing 8. And that inconsistency kind of puts him in a position where he's not as consistent in terms of his actual performance night in and night out. The eighth man in Gonzaga's rotation historically has averaged about 11 and a half minutes per game. So Stromer sits under 15 minutes per game for an entire season, even after averaging 23 and a half minutes per game as a freshman. That's the worst case scenario for Dusty Stromer, is the minutes per game drop. And that doesn't allow him to blossom. The efficiency numbers not only don't improve, but they either stagnate or they even drop because of that inconsistency for him. The worst case scenario for Dusty Stromer is the outside shooting is just inconsistent. Last year, he finished the year shooting 36.5% from three. That was with a poor first half, a stronger second half, a really strong finish to the season in terms of efficiency. And the worst case scenario is he's under 35% for the entire year. He's just not productive as an outside shooter. The worst case scenario for Dusty Stromer is that not only is the outside shooting not there, but that improved offensive versatility, the bag, isn't there. The ball handling maybe is only slightly improved or is about the same as last year. The passing and floor vision doesn't seem to have improved much, and he's not able to have a valuable role for this team offensively, which makes him a liability on that end of the floor and tough to play in many situations. The worst case scenario for Dusty Stromer is that his on-ball defense is still solid. It's hard to imagine that he's just completely a non-factor in that area defensively, but pick and roll navigation remains an issue. We saw some communication problems last year in the pick and roll. It's hard to learn how to navigate the PNR successfully. In a worst case scenario, he's not improved in that area. And his strength isn't enough to generate more takeaways. He's not being asked to guard the opposing team's best player. He's not in a situation where his defense is keeping him on the floor or getting him onto the floor in important situations for the Zags. The worst case scenario for Dusty Stromer is against good teams. When Gonzaga plays the UConns, when they play the St. Mary's, when they play in the NCAA tournament, and he's tightening the rotation like Mark Few always does, Stromer's not a factor. He's not playing in those games, or he's playing very little in those games, and he's the guy or one of the guys who kind of gets squeezed out of consistent playing time when Mark Few is tightening up that rotation. And the worst case scenario for Dusty Stromer is that at the end of the year, when we're projecting what the 2025-26 roster is going to look like and where Gonzaga needs to make additions in the transfer portal, there's a lot of conversation about adding a small forward, adding a wing, adding a two guard to the roster, in part because there's not a lot of confidence in Stromer's ability to handle a big role in that spot in his junior year. Let's talk about that junior year. And let's talk about our expected role and expected production for Dusty Stromer. This isn't going to be a spoiler. It's somewhere in the middle of the best and the worst case scenarios. That's why we lay them out the way that we do. We're going to talk about what we think Stromer's sophomore season is going to look like in Spokane, whether we think he has an NBA future or not, all that and more coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, let's talk about FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Right now, when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets. And you get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Gonzaga's odds to win that 2025 national championship, they haven't changed. They're still at plus 2,000 right now. If you want to get in on that action, it is well worth the $5 investment, especially since you get $200 in bonus bets, whether or not Gonzaga brings home that trophy in 2025. Folks, head to FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, closing out the show, looking at Dusty Stromer's expected role, expected production heading into his sophomore season. We're also going to talk about Stromer's future. Got 2 more years of eligibility at Gonzaga, what that might look like, what we expect for him the following year, maybe talk about his NBA aspirations and what that profile might look like at this point as well. So I kind of already teased this. I don't think Dusty Stromer is going to start this season. I believe the starting lineup is going to be Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman in the backcourt. That seems about as solid as it could possibly be. Graham Ike is going to start at the center spot. And then your 2 forwards, I'm projecting it to be Ben Gregg and Michael Ajayi. I think Khalif Battle could be a starter as well. He could start and Ajayi could play the 4 and Ben Gregg could come off the bench. I think it's more likely that Gregg starts and that Ajayi starts at the 3. Maybe Battle starts at the 3. Maybe Stromer starts at the 3. They have a lot of different options for those last 2 spots, but my projected starting 5 is Ike, Gregg, Ajayi, Hickman, and Nembhard. Khalif Battle is my projected 6th man. And then Stromer and Huff, it's kind of, I think Huff is the 7th man in the sense that he's going to come into the game sooner than Dusty Stromer, but I think it's more likely that Stromer, if we were doing just total minutes per game, I think it's more likely that Stromer finishes 7th on the team in total minutes per game, whereas Huff would finish 8th, although I think Huff would come into the game sooner than Stromer, if that makes sense. I could see a situation where Battle and Huff stub in together. Huff would be coming in for Ike. Battle could be coming in for literally anybody else on the floor, just because of the versatility Gonzaga has with their lineup. And then the next time there's a dead ball or shortly after that, that's when Stromer subs in for, again, pretty much anybody at that point. This team just has enough versatility to make that work. The problem is, or I guess I don't want to say problem, but the 8th man in the rotation doesn't play a lot of minutes. And again, it's kind of between Huff and Stromer in terms of who you consider the 8th man. But Stromer played about 20 minutes per game, even coming off the bench last year. He played about 28 minutes per game as a starter, played close to 20 minutes per game as a backup. But he was number 6 last year because Gonzaga's bench was pretty much non-existent outside of him and Braden Huff. This year they add Khalif Battle into the bench mix, which is a huge addition. And frankly, Khalif Battle's not cutting into Braden Huff's minutes, but he's got to cut into somebody's minutes. And the most likely candidate in terms of losing minutes to Khalif Battle based on last year is Dusty Stromer. I think he'll take a little bit of minutes from like a Michael Ajayi. I think he'll take some minutes from Ben Gregg. I think he'll take some minutes from Hickman and Nembhard, although not much. Those guys both played 35 plus minutes per game last year. I do think they'll come down a little bit, but not a ton. I think, unfortunately, Stromer is the person who sees that playing time cut into. And looking at the history of who is 8th in minutes per game at Gonzaga historically, over the last 8 seasons, the person who finishes 8th on the team in minutes per game is about 11.5. Again, I think Huff's probably going to be that person, but projecting Stromer to play 23, 25 minutes a game, it's hard to see just based on the amount of players they have on this roster, the amount of talent they have on this team, I think we're looking at a situation where Stromer plays more like 15 minutes per game, 15 to 18, somewhere in there. Any more than that, and I'm just not sure where it's coming from. I'm not sure who's I've seen people say this on social media. They've responded to me and said, "Oh, I think your minutes per game projections are wrong." And I've said, "Well, where are they coming from?" And people say, "Well, I think Hickman's going to play less, right? I want to see Hickman play less." It's like, maybe that's what you want, but Mark Few's not going to play Nolan Hickman 25 minutes a game after he played 35 last year. Like, I'm telling you that right now, it's not going to happen. You may think that it should happen, but it's not. So for Dusty, there's only so many minutes to go around. I project him in the 15 to 18 minute range. I also would like to point out that I did this research on the eighth most minutes per game on Gonzaga's roster for the last 8 years and took note of who the players were, and it's quite fascinating. 3 of the players, Killian Tilly, Anton Watson, Julian Strother, are NBA players, or were NBA players in Tilly's case. One of them is Hunter Salas, who's potentially going to be an All-American this year at Wake Forest. One of them is Ben Gregg. This is a tremendous group of talented players. So being 8th in the rotation for Gonzaga, not a sentence of concern, not something that doesn't mean you're not going to be a big-time contributor for this program. Case in point, many of those guys ended up becoming huge players at Gonzaga, and like we said, 3 of them are in the NBA. So overall statistical projections for Dusty Stromer, 15 to 18 minutes per game. I think some of the numbers baseline won't look all that different. 5 to 7 points per game, that's around where he was last year. 3 rebounds per game, it's about where he was last year. Would love to see the assists up a bit. He's 1.1. I'd love to see him 1.5, 1.8, something like that, just a slight increase there with a decrease in turnovers. That is something I think we will see. I think just the difference between freshman year and sophomore year in terms of processing speed and things like that, less dumb turnovers, more recognition of making good passes. So I think something like 1.5 assists and 0.8 turnovers, 0.7 turnovers per game. It's subtle differences like that show growth and improvements for Stromer. Percentage-wise, I'd love to see him 37, 38% from 3. Like I said, he finished last year 36.5%, although that's kind of misleading based on poor shooting in the first half of the year, much better shooting later on. But 37, 38% from 3, 45% on 2s. He was 37% last year, so that'd be a pretty big jump for him. Something like 84, 85% from the free throw line. He's always been very solid there. That's kind of the quick and dirty projections in terms of just statistical projections for Dusty Stromer next season. What's the future look like for Stromer? Well, he's got 2 years of eligibility after this year. This year will be his sophomore year, then the next season's junior year, the next season after that's his senior year, then he's done after that point. Again, assuming he stays through all 4 years. Stromer strikes me as somebody pretty likely to be a 4-year guy, at least a 3-year guy. If these projections end up being in the ballpark for Stromer as a 7th man, 8th man coming off the bench, playing a valuable role, but not necessarily the kind of role that gets you, straight into the league type of thing. I think that creates a situation where he at least returns for his junior year, because pretty much everybody's gone. Ryan Nembhard gone after this year. Nolan Hickman, Michael Ajayi, Ben Gregg, Khalif Battle, every one of those guys is gone, guaranteed, after this year. None of them are coming back, barring, I guess, an early season injury and a medical red shirt. All those guys are gone. Unclear about Graham Ike or Steele Venters. For Ike's purposes, doesn't really matter for Stromer, but for Venters, that's a pretty significant player that alters how much Stromer plays as a junior. Still, I believe that Dusty Stromer will start for Gonzaga as a junior. I think he's kind of on a somewhat similar trajectory to a Ben Gregg type, where I know Ben Gregg didn't start till halfway into his junior year, but you develop behind the scenes on the bench. You steadily improved your playing time year in, year out, and then you become a starter, and then you kind of blossom into a star, or at least a really big time contributor. That's kind of what I see for Stromer. You look at the 25-26 roster, you see Braden Smith likely going to start at the 1, replacing Nembhard. You see Stromer potentially filling in at the 2. If Venters is back, I think you have Smith, Stromer, Venters all starting 1, 2, 3. You need to find a power forward somewhere, and then you have Braden Huff starting at the 5. That to me feels like a fairly likely, or at least plausible, starting lineup for Gonzaga in 25-26. That would also have Emmanuel Chente coming off the bench, Davis Fogel coming off the bench as a freshman, Ismaila Diani, who I don't think will start alongside Braden Huff, and I don't think will start as a sophomore, because I don't think he's going to play much this year. Maybe Junsu Kyo's back for his senior year coming off the bench as well. If Venters doesn't come back, I think you're almost absolutely certain that Dusty Stromer is going to start at that point. So I think you're looking at a player who's going to have a much bigger role as a junior, very likely in that starting lineup. Ideally, he's shown enough improvement this year offensively that you can not only have him start as a junior, but play a valuable role for this team on both ends of the ball. In terms of NBA profile right now, he's still pretty raw. The size isn't there. He's too skinny. He's gotten stronger. You could tell, you could see the craziness, but he still would be very, very skinny for an NBA 3 or even an NBA 2. But he's got the skill set of a modern 3-and-D wing. He's a good defensive player who proved last year that if he's got open corner threes, he can knock them down. That's what the NBA wants. They want guys. They don't want a bunch of guys who need the ball in their hands, who are ball dominant players. Like there's a spot for those guys, obviously, but most players that NBA scouts and general managers are looking at are role players. And Dusty Stromer has the requisite skills to be that kind of player at the next level. The outside shot needs to be consistent. They need to know that if he's got an open look from 3, he's knocking it down most of the time. The defensive instincts are there. His motor is there. The size, the physicality needs to be there. Right now, projecting Dusty Stromer as an NBA player is a little bit tough because he doesn't look physically like an NBA player. But if he gets stronger, if the three-point shooting improves, I absolutely could see it. And yeah, there's other stuff, the ball handling, the floor vision, those things that I mentioned earlier, but you want to see improvement in those areas. And certainly NBA scouts care about them, but it's not the primary thing that's going to drive Dusty Stromer's NBA profile. That's, again, the two things we talked about, the defense and the three-point shooting. How good Dusty Stromer is at driving to the basket, the floater game, things like that, they're just not that important to his profile because it's not really the kind of role he's going to be identified for as an NBA player. That's going to wrap it up for us today here on the Locked On Zags podcast with our Dusty Stromer player preview series. We got plenty more of these coming over the next month or so as we get ready for the start of the college basketball season, November 4th. For Gonzaga at the Spokane Arena taking on the Baylor Bears. Before that, we know we got at least two. We got 2 exhibition games. We got the charity exhibition against USC on the 26th, and then we got an exhibition against Warner Pacific on October 30th. So we got Gonzaga basketball is right around the corner. We're going to have more of these player previews. We'll keep you up to date on recruiting stuff. We'll, of course, keep talking about conference realignment as well as we learn more about what's going on in the Pac-12 before Gonzaga joins in 2026. Thanks again, folks, for listening. And until next time, as always, go Zags.